Greetings, listeners. The following is an excerpt from my fantasy novel, The Products of Grayce. I've been working on this concept for the last 10 years, and I am proud to finally put a piece of it out there for your listening pleasure. I am the owner of this content, and there will be no redistribution of any kind to any site without my explicit consent. Furthermore, the following is subject to change and may not reflect the final product when it is released. With that said, I hope you enjoy my prologue. Shikari. Pale, dry bark was rough against his palm, so unlike the bark encasing his fingers like skin. The Shikari's was brown, flexible, and in a way, rubbery. That was how bark should be. This tree lacked a branch jutting from the left side, so it couldn't have been the same one he'd seen so many hours ago. He feared that whatever infected these woods might seep into him, so he swept his palm from its surface, letting it sway as he continued onward, inspecting his surroundings. The mist was a presence in his nose, preventing him from truly identifying a scent. And of course I'm lost. Can they truly be here? A village this far in the depths of nothingness should be off the grid. A mirthless smile burned his cheeks, but if not for the misty air freezing his lungs into icy cocoons, the silence would drown his wakefulness. A coin-sized orb of fire essence dangled at his belt, burning red and orange as it feasted on mana, the omnipresent fuel that breathed life into all magic from his surroundings to keep him warm. It was a small comfort. The only sounds to be heard were those of his thoughts, the unresponsive voice in his head his only company. His shoulders trembled in heavy black armor as he gazed suspiciously at trees and brush. He hadn't picked out identical features, but he'd begun to suspect that he'd seen them hundreds of times now, breaking through the mist in his path, disappearing behind it as he passed by, only to reappear when he advanced. His feet and knees were sore from the aimless trek against solid dead silt, and his antlers hung heavy at either side of his brow, but at least the cold reduced the need to sweat, as humans called it. The merchant he'd met at the crossroads was right. He'd thought he'd seen mist in the weeping peaks to the south, or even his forested homeland overseas, but this, though he knew mountains flanked him to the north and south, whichever way those were, he could not see them, or even the sky. It was too easy to get lost when the shell of white surrounding you was thicker than a woolen blanket, but colder than the frigid fjords of Excalibria. Perhaps the merchant had led him on. They had told him to simply follow the road, yet gave no advice on what to do if the road up and disappeared. The Shikari cursed his unwillingness to give up coin. He should have parted with it when the merchant offered to find him a coachman, a cradle warden, as he called it. As always, his pride had overcome him, and he was forced to confront the consequences thereof. If he carried on like this for much longer, he'd run out of rations. There was no hunting or forage in these woods, only the corpses of wanderers with no meat left to eat on their bones. At least one had a hefty coin purse. Why a village in the middle of nowhere, barely able to sustain off its own resources? All sources, reliable ones at least, had pointed toward this valley as the Archspaun's next move. They had been silent for the last 2 years, so the Shikari jumped at the chance, but there had been something or someone awfully special in this village to elicit coming out into the middle of nowhere. The Shikari did not particularly care for their plans, however. He craved one thing only, and he would have it at any cost. The Shikari became suddenly aware of a distant burble, a consistent sound that only just became loud enough to detect. If his suspicions were correct, he was not as lost as he'd hoped. He quickened his pace toward the sound of what he hoped was running water, for water meant people. Even if he found no people, he could perhaps follow this brook back to the Aurora-Seam River where he may hire a cradle warden. The thicket of ever-gray pine trees looked as if carved from stone as they blocked his path, but they brushed against his armor as he passed between them to reveal a babbling brook beyond. The mist's thickness subsided somewhat here, allowing him to study it without difficulty. The calmly running water was ankle-deep, having barely cut into the earth, but wide enough so that one could not simply leap over it in one bound. It conformed to the bends and bulges of an uphill slant, its source clouded in the distant haze from where it twisted, turned, fell into ponds, and then slipped downstream. The water split around jutting rocks, shredding into droplets against the branches of a fallen oak tree to the left, where it once again disappeared into the vale downstream. A sudden dark movement caught his eye. The Shikari froze, Deactivating the fire essence on his belt, he willed his magic to make himself unseeable, feeling nothing out of the ordinary as the enchantment took effect. The only indication of his success was the presence of black particles speckling the air between himself and the object of his pause, a lone figure across the stream. He had been so motionless that he only now summoned the Shikari's attention, but otherwise stuck out against the gray backdrop. He unslung a sack from his shoulder as he lowered before the roots of a tree. In any other forest, the Shikari may have stepped forth to reveal himself and ask for directions. As it was, he waited cautiously as the lone boy reached into his sack to retrieve varied fruits. Apples, berries, citrus, and bread the boy nestled between the curving roots that accepted it like the waiting arms of a druid. This food was not for eating. The Shikari's stomach clawed at it, reaching for the food, but he remained at the edge of the brook, yearning to understand this boy's purpose here. Silencing his footsteps with his uncanny magic, the Shikari circled to his right, around a curve in the stream where he could catch a better view of the boy and his doings. Gray eyes peered mournfully at the tree, reflecting the shades of his surroundings. Messy black curls framed the boy's face. What light there was seemed to reflect off it with occasional flecks of silver, shifting when he moved his head. It reminded the Shikari of a duck's plumage. Strong, pale hands cupped as if in prayer, the boy opened his mouth to speak. A low, tired growl, both dreamy and resentful at once, emitted from his throat. I offer up this tribute to you, O guardian of this forsaken forest, so that I may be protected, not lose my way, and be free of eavesdroppers, so that I may practice magic in peace. So much for that last request. The Shikari inclined, curious as he watched the mage boy remove his shirt and shoes. He threw them beside his offering. Then he turned to the brook, his eyes passing right over the Shikari's unseeable bulk and stepping into the deep water without hesitation. Cold as it was where he stood, the Shikari had trouble believing the water was any more pleasant. He wondered what element the mage possessed, or what circumstances he was under to need to practice magic outside the village. Most towns had designated pits for magic, and some allowed its use anywhere, with the frequent exception of fire, but misuse of any of the 7 elements could have drastic consequences. The boy watched his feet, treading to the center of the stream, where he stopped, closed his eyes, and breathed. Just use magic already. The Shikari lifted an impatient eyebrow, though the mirthless smile, as always, remained on his face. Perhaps he possessed water essence, and was so horribly bad at it that he couldn't even manipulate a strand of this stream. The mage assumed an inflexible, athletic stance, leading the Shikari to believe he commanded one of the physical elements. Plant or earth, perhaps. A silent breath parted the boy's lips, and the Shikari honed in on him, drowning crashing water into silence. A rigid flourish of the mage's fists blasted a torrent of emerald green at his either flank. The cold air seemed to freeze against the Shikari's skin. His throat hinged. The Shikari's hammer whirled from its holster before he considered drawing it. Though every muscle, every tissue throbbed as it demanded he turn and run, he remained frozen to the spot, mouth gaped, temples pounding. He was no inquisitor. He did not concern himself with dark mages. Even so, a part of him always knew this day would come, for such problems were common among those who remained in his line of work. The dark mage twisted inelegantly, green flames dancing in his wake. The Shikari stood there, watching the exercise, the metal handle of his hammer getting warm in his grip. It felt like a minute, perhaps 2, before the Shikari could move once more. I could kill him here and now, but I risk him finding me. Perhaps he could send a messenger hawk with a report to the Inquisitors Guild, but it would take too much time. He had come here for his own purposes, not to haunt dark mages. But what if this one was involved? What if he was the evil mastermind behind the Archspawn's plotting? Killing him was risky, but it was just as perilous to let him live. The Shikari advanced, his feet clenching as frigid water flooded his boots. He eyed the flames. He'd heard the stories. One touch and he was a blackened husk. The mage roared, clawing at invisible enemies in a desperate struggle to engulf them in flame. Globules of green, the size of entire people, hissed and then dissipated. It was overkill. No doubt the mage needed half as much firepower to burn a person alive, so why waste precious mana? The Shikari watched cautiously. He would wait for the dance to end before closing in. With every thrust of magic, a shiver rippled up the boy's arms, his spine. For a moment, the Shikari made eye contact with him, his brows pressed together nervously, rippling his forehead and quirking his mouth. His gray eyes, wherein the green flames reflected their enigmatic light, shimmered with fear. At first, the Shikari thought the boy had detected him through his unseeability, but when he turned and continued blasting hellfire from his palms, the Shikari realized the fear was not at being discovered, but... Does he? No, it couldn't be so. It did not align with the stories, and yet... Does he fear his own magic? The dark mage roared, and with it pushed as much fire from his gullet as he could. His wrathful magic persisted for a moment before he bent over, severing the spell, using his knees for support. He panted heavily, beads of sweat plopping into the brook. A whispered curse escaped his lips as he quivered. "Mana fatigue, take me." Hammer braced, the Shikari drew in close to the mage, a voice in his head whispering to him, "Purge him from his misery." His grip tightened around the handle. He was ready to do an inquisitor's work, but something stayed his hand. The mage's fear seeped into him. The voice came again. "Why such cold feet?" The Shikari lowered his weapon, letting it dangle at his side. He couldn't kill a dark mage who feared his own magic. "Must be the water in my boots." The boy rose, unbludgeoned, and retreated to the edge of the pond, where he bent over the stream and washed the sweat from his face and hair, retrieving a leather waterskin from his sack and filling it. Besides, the smile on the Shikari's face became devious. This lone boy must have the ability to traverse these mists alone. Perhaps he can lead me to my destination. Perhaps then I shall reconsider killing him. After lingering in the area briefly, the boy turned and headed into the trees. The Shikari plucked an orange from the bundle at the roots of the tree and dug into it with his teeth. His spell would keep the boy from noticing.